And what's great about these vintage bikes is that they remind you that you're on a vintage machine. They don't really do anything better than a new modern bike, but what they do really well is give a feedback, a mechanical feedback to the rider that makes you feel much more connected to the road and the actual machine itself. When you do ride these, at 70 miles an hour, it feels like you're going 150, and that's what's kind of cool about these bikes. They'll still go over 100 miles an hour. Sometimes they sound like they're falling apart, but they'll do it. And that's not really what they're designed for. What they're really designed for is letting you be connected again with a vintage machine that has a kind of a heartbeat all its own. Very different than a new bike. Sometimes new bikes, the hardest part about riding them is staying awake. And so an old bike really reminds you that you are integral as far as the performance goes, because these old bikes really need a rider. This is Dustin from Kott Motorcycles, and we're going to be talking about this build. It's not named yet. I haven't decided what I wanted to call it, but so what we're starting with right now is a 1974 CB750. It's got Excel shoulder aluminum wheels, stock displacement engine that's been fully rebuilt, carburetors are fully rebuilt, and we've experimented again with a couple of front-end modifications, hub designs, and things like that. And there's a few things that we've done wiring-wise with disguising some of the wiring underneath the fuel tank. And on this particular build, we're doing two separate seat designs, and that was at the behest of the actual client, wanting to have the opportunity to have two up, and then also, of course, the solo cafe seat. So a couple new things about this build, and I like to play around dimensionally with what I'm doing on these builds to sort of offset either expectations or some of the things I've done in the past. And what's funny about this headlight is someone saw it and they said it looked like Beetlejuice, like the guy with the shrunken head. And I really like it. Dimensionally, it's almost incongruently small compared to the size of the tank, and that was very intentional. And what I really like about it is it showcased how elegant the fork legs are. The fork legs on this are only 35 millimeter, and so they're already sort of dainty. And then without any headlight brackets, you see it's just the clip-on bars, and it really showcases that elegant stance. And then this new headlight bracket was really cool, polished stainless, that mounts right into the actual triple clamp, and it's got a 90-degree bend, and it houses this small headlamp. And it's a halogen 12-volt beam. I mean, it still lights up. It's the 4th of July when this thing comes on. So lighting wasn't an issue. Just size-wise, I wanted to sort of experiment dimensionally with it and see what we could come up with. Same kind of approach with the handlebars. I'm still doing the stealth starter button, but now I've started to thread it actually into the clutch perch itself, which is really nice. And then nothing to it. And when you come over to this side, we'll talk about this in a second, but we're running a Triumph T120 front hub. And this is a new design that I've come up with, mounting this brake switch underneath the actual brake perch. Very stealth too, and it's just a couple of wires coming into the back of the headlight with this fabric wrap. Just trying to make it clean and sanitary. And it can be challenging to run a brake switch with a drum brake, and then this was sort of the solution. Stock triple clamp, it's been shaved down and polished. I like doing that. It just maintains sort of the vintage feel to everything. And then as we come back through here, you're going to notice I ran another GS750 fuel tank. This GS stock has a huge gap right here against this frame. I've had to modify the stock index pegs a little further up to make this tank make sense, but then I've scabbed in this piece of sheet steel to sort of close that gap and make it look a little bit more congruent to the machine. And the reason I've been using this tank, dimensionally it does a lot of really cool things to the 750 frame, but namely, it has a bolt pattern that fits this water jet cut emblem that I'm using now, which is a really cool touch. It's so much nicer than just the decal or the pinstriping of the Kott logo. And also underneath this fuel tank, we'll talk about it in a moment, is all the electronics are laid out under here. There's a lot of room for the battery, reg-rec, starter solenoid. You'll see how it's all laid out. So I've never really been tremendously inspired by the Brat seat design, but as far as ergonomically, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the solo rider, but as far as having a two-up situation, if you wanted to carry a passenger, this seat makes a lot of sense. And so this particular client wanted two separate seats. And I hadn't done that before. I thought it was kind of cool to do that. Here's the first one, and then I'll show you the second one. And they just, really, it's just the same pan design with the same mount system. You see what we've done here. And then this just corresponds with these tabs that are welded into the frame. And I mean, it's that simple to swap out to have, you know, the cafe cowling. And this cowling, of course, helps to hold the rider in position, especially with the rear sets and the lower bars. Ergonomically, this makes a lot more sense. Under acceleration, oftentimes, that's why I'm not a huge fan of the Brat seat. Under acceleration, you can end up sliding off the back of the seat. And it becomes this battle between trying to support yourself, pulling yourself back toward the bars, and then fighting your foot peg position. Right now, with this seat, it really allows your foot to rest on the balls of your feet, to really stay in position here, and then you're in it to win it. It's just the right position to be riding on this particular style of bike. So we were talking about underneath that fuel tank, the GS750 fuel tank, the advantages of using that tank is that you have so much real estate on the back side of the frame here. And as you can see, we've laid everything out. Just along the backbone of the frame, we're hiding the battery. It's obviously a downsized Shirai battery that's got 3 times the cranking amps of a lead acid battery the same size. We've got a reg rec unit, starter solenoid so we can maintain electric start, and then we've got a terminal block. That's really what this is doing, is it's allowing us to not have to have a junction block or a connector. This is really taking the place of that, and it has such a cleaner effect, and it's insulated too. So we're not terribly concerned about anything shorting out against this because we've got this plastic covering over the top of it. And then the starter solenoid has the inline fuse, which is it's so sanitary. You get the tank off. If you need to swap the fuse, you can just pull this out. And I'm just so satisfied with doing this. It allows us, of course, an opportunity to leave this completely clean. And underneath that Brat seat, we don't have any room for any of the electronics. And so this makes the most sense possible. So one of the cool features on this bike, among others, was this the use of this 1971-72 Triumph T120 conical hub. And it presents a couple of challenges. It's the second build that we've used it on. One of the challenges is that the axle diameter is smaller than the original Honda axle. And the way that we've sort of overcome that is by making this stainless split lock bushing. It does a couple of things. It actually centers the wheel. Since we're so far away from stock, it centers the wheel with this acting as a spacer, and then it's got a split lock in it. And so when we tighten down, this thing clamps around the original axle and keeps the axle from spinning. You know, one of the nice touches too with running this conical hub was elimination of all the brackets and everything on the fork tube. So just cut all that stuff off, sanded it down with an orbital sander, and it just made a nice clean look. And it really accentuates the Excel shouldered wheel, the aluminum Excel shouldered wheel. I've really liked using these lately. It gives that sort of British vintage inspiration that I've always really liked with this era of motorcycle. This is kind of a neat feature that we've been incorporating, this new Kott keychain. It just sort of develops some exclusivity with the people that have entrusted me to build these bikes for them. And of course, we never repeat the builds. We don't do the same thing twice. Even though there might be inspirations from past builds, we'll never do anything directly related to a past build. And this is kind of one of those things that sort of separates, I hope, like I said, develop some exclusivity with the people that entrust us with these builds. Again, using these velocity stacks, this thing's jetted to the hilt. It's got 42 pilots, 120 mains. And you know, it's funny, we haven't taken this thing out on the road yet. This will be the first Maiden voyage ride, and so we'll see how this performs. If anything, it might still be a little bit lean, just based upon the exhaust choice that we use. We'll focus on that on the other side of the bike. But if it is, we're just going to pop this open and pop a bigger main jet in there, possibly a 125. We just did one that had 127.5s in it, which is real thirsty for these bikes, but that's what they require. So this is the same tank that I always use. It's my proprietary parallelogram design, really focusing in on the welds here. And with clean aluminum, this is 090 aluminum, and when so long as it's really clean, you can get good clean welds. And this is mostly just fusion welding, and it really gives that nice stack of dime look and cleans up the edges so that it doesn't distract from the frame lines. But also on this, instead of polishing it, I wanted to develop some contrast from the polished covers, the engine covers. I wanted to throw in a little more contrast with the satin finish that actually sort of matched the non-polished stainless tank badge. And again, just to sort of play not only dimensionally with certain things, but also with the finishes to sort of create a uniqueness to each build. The rear set is becoming more and more standardized. Now that I have this plate design, this is something also, I used to cut all these out by hand. And this particular design, ergonomically, it puts the rider in the best position because it's not a lot higher than the original peg position, but it is effectively about 6 inches further back. And it keeps people's knees out of their ears, and it puts your knee, for most riders, right into the tank indentation, which is my target. And so this has become more and more standardized, this actual plate. One more change that I've made this year for all the 2015 models is this arced license plate bracket. It just, aesthetically, it's more pleasing. It sort of follows, copies and repeats certain flowing aspects of the bike. And it puts the license plate bracket in a more functional position, acting doubly as a chain guard. And then finally, one last frame mod. In order to facilitate both seat designs, this is something I very rarely do, but this hoop came through here, and what it does is it supports the back side of the Brat style seat, and then it blends in nicely with the lines of this particular cafe cowling type seat. Pound for pound, the Hagen shock has always been a go-to for this style of bike. I mean, it matches aesthetically what it is that I'm trying to achieve, but also performance-wise, it's far superior to especially the old shocks, but compared to some of the other options, I really enjoy them. And then these tips have been really awesome. This is a stainless tip from Kott Engineering, and they're so, I don't know, that dimensionally it does everything you want it to do. It's got that very antique sort of Norton Commando feel to it with the reverse megaphone. It sounds good, it performs well, and I really like the contrast between the stainless and then of course the chrome. Going again with the stainless braided line, even though this is a push lock design, these AN fittings, because this return line isn't under any pressure, it's fine without any clamping. But when you follow it down into this area at the motor side, I thought this was a really nice touch, having this anodized blue shroud over a hose clamp. So this is the far side of that T120 conical hub. And as you can see, the artisanship of this thing with the cooling, the casting of this cooling scoop, and then with this unique design of how these two actuators pull together, and then they have this return spring in between. Just such a neat piece. I think, arguably, it's probably one of the prettiest things that Triumph did during that era. This would have been 71 and 72, and it's really cool to retrofit it into a Honda front end. So this is the part of the build that I love, man. I just took this back from its first maiden voyage, and I'm super stoked. That's so much fun. This is what makes all the efforts worth it, is to finally throw a leg over these things and see what they're capable of doing. Now, this is the part of the build where I start taking notes performance-wise. Presently, I already hogged the pilot jets out to 42, so that's fair. And then as far as the main jet, it's presently at a 120. And it's still just maybe a little bit thirsty. If I just left it alone, even I can hardly tell the difference, but I might go up a little bit on the main jet. But other than that, I love the visibility of the front tire beyond the small headlamp. It's super cool looking. It just feels, you really feel connected to this machine, and it sits low. I'm surprised. I don't know why exactly yet. It does seem to sit lower than usual, but I really like the feel on the road. It feels like you're really connected to the machine. And the clutch is great, tires feel fine, suspension, shifting is incredibly smooth, no oil leaks. That's something I always check for. 750s are a little challenging as far as keeping oil tight. Sometimes they can start leaking on you, but this one's solid. The pipe sounds great, great performance aspects. Front brakes. The brakes are what you could expect from a 40-year-old motorcycle. It's got, collectively 4 shoes worth of braking power. But we're not trying to build a track machine. We're trying to build a bike that celebrates the vintage aesthetic while still having modern day rideability and the performance specifications that aren't supposed to be like a brand new motorcycle, but I'm very happy with it. Everything really checks out as far as I'm concerned.